Now, let's try to do what we can here in our last segment with the Chickamauga anniversary. Today, the anniversary of Thomas's famous stand on the second day of Chickamauga, the Rock of Chickamauga, holding off an army with a single disorganized Army Corps. But let's also put it in the context of the Russophobia. The Russian fleet arrived 150 years ago, Tuesday, right? After the casualties of Gettysburg, after the victory of Vicksburg, but after the draft riots and then the horrors of Chickamauga, the Russian fleet arrives in New York. October 12th arrives in San Francisco. And this was a tremendous morale uplift. It is the only example of a foreign state providing direct military assistance and political diplomatic support to the United States, to Lincoln, in the course of this. And there were weeks and weeks of celebration. You go look in Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and the rest of them, the Russian officers were lionized. We even have an engraving of the Russian ball, the dance that was held at the Academy of Music. And this was done by a young artist, Winslow Homer, right, who went on to do all those paintings. Some of them are still in the museum there at Phillips Academy in Andover. This was the reality. And when we came out of the Civil War, the policy, the orientation of most Americans was the United States was friendly to Russia because of these fleets. The fleets came with orders that if the British and the French attacked the United States and or Russia, these fleets would go into action, raiding British and French commerce in the same way that the Alabama and the other Confederate commerce raiders had done. They would have exacted a terrible toll. This gave the British pause. So that is the pro-Russian attitude, was that the Tsar had said to the British and the French already in the fall of 1862, if you interfere in the American Civil War, I will accept that as casus belli for Russia. And the fleets might have been modest compared to the British one, but there were also these huge land armies. And make no mistake, the British realized what those armies could do in a place like India, putting a quick end to the British Empire. There was also a heritage of sympathy to Prussia because of the ability of Prussia to pin down Napoleon III, keep the French troops along the Rhine, don't let them go to Mexico, and also the willingness of German savers, right, just German people, to buy United States government bonds. So the alignment was U.S., Russia, Prussia against colonialists, British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Austria-Hungary. Italy, by the way, Italy might have gone with the U.S., Russia, Prussia because of the Italian and Prussian convergence against Austria-Hungary. But if it had been U.S., Russia, Prussia, maybe Italy, no World War I, no World War II. You can't have it you can't have a world war unless you've got Russia and Germany on different sides. Ask King Edward VII. That's what he knew. That's what he acted on. So it was Admiral Lisowski and his fleet that came into New York Harbor on Tuesday, and that's what we'll be marking. Now, I'm ashamed. The Russophobia of the U.S. media and elites is disgusting. This morning on Diane Rehm, we had the international panel, oh, can we trust Putin? How about can you trust Kerry, who is a liar? Right? He was pointed out by Putin and Lavrov that he's a liar, and they're right. He's a liar. He also lied about his position on Iraq. They didn't seem to notice that, but I did. Chris Hayes and Matt Taibbi, another disgusting exercise. Two cretins. They showed a series of pictures of animals which they claimed looked like Putin. You want to get into that game and start doing that to your shibboleths and poobahs? You won't like it. And in particular, this guy Taibbi is a grinning snake oil salesman, hypocrite, who's going to grin and tell us about how bad Russia is. Come on, you're supposed to know that the U.S. is run by a vampire squid, and you're hostile to the Russians. I would thank Stephen Cohen for his remarks, right? The United States, these left liberals, should thank Putin for helping to avoid a disastrous war and the ignominious collapse of the Obama administration through Obama's own stupidity, ineptitude, and cowardice, rather than blaming Putin. But now, let's see if we have a little bit of time. Concerning two individual Russians, let me point out, Charles Darnaud, A-R-N-A-U-D, was an advisor to John C. Fremont, who at the beginning in 1861 was the Union commander in the West, and to Grant. Lincoln, you'll remember, Lincoln had said, if the Confederates get an army into Illinois in 1861, that will lead to British-French recognition. Now, the Confederates had a couple of defense lines. First, they wanted to do the Ohio River, including Belmont, Kentucky, where there are bluffs, kind of like Vicksburg. And then they had to fall back on Island Number 10, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Mill Spring. Grant was operating out of Cairo, Illinois. So this guy, Darnaud, experienced Russian officer, engineer, and spy, did a kind of subterranean, surreptitious trip all around Kentucky and Tennessee. And he came back and he said to Grant, do one thing, seize Paducah, Kentucky. This is where the Tennessee River and a little bit further on the Cumberland River go into the Ohio River. You take those two, you've got a direct water line down into Alabama, and that is what they did. So it was this guy, Darnaud, who sets up Grant to take Paducah, to wreck the Ohio River line of Jefferson Davis and Leonidas Polk, and then send the gunboats down all the way into Alabama, freaking out the Confederates. It meant that the war was transferred out of Illinois and into Confederate-held territory. This means that Darnaud, and Grant says so in his memoirs, was key in setting up Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, which is how Grant made his name. So we can say that Charles Darnaud is instrumental in helping Grant launch his career. How about that? Grant comes to you thanks to a Russian advisor. Here's another one, and this applies especially to Chickamauga today. General John Basil Turchin, Don Cossack, veteran of the Crimean War, exponent of total war. He wants liberating of the slaves, and he pioneers the technique used by Sherman of economic warfare, right? Destroy assets. So at the Battle of Chickamauga, there are two separate moments where the Confederates are threatening to break through, and it's a counterattack by Turchin's brigade that prevents the Confederates from breaking through. We can say that without Turchin, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and probably the greatest tactician of the entire war on any side, Thomas became the Rock of Chickamauga thanks to help from Turchin. We can go into that in detail. And then, at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, Chattanooga, in November of 1864, we've got 2 months after Chickamauga in any case. Turchin is the guy who leads the Union charge up this tremendous mountain and takes the day. And that's what got Grant his final promotion to head the Army of the Potomac. This is November 1863. So, two Russians helped make Grant and Thomas what they were. So, worth pondering. We'll be back next week on World Crisis Radio. See you Tuesday evening at the National Press Club, the anniversary of the Russian fleets. And don't forget, Tarpley for Fedhead. Tarpley for Fedhead.